Welcome back to the Art Club Safety Training Series. Today, we're going to cover crystalline silica dust and prevention. Once again, I'm John Kenny with Cotney Consulting Group, your host, and I'd like to welcome all the Art Club members back to today's presentation. What we're going to talk about today is crystalline silica. What is it? First of all, it's very jagged, micro-sized, crystallized glass type shards. So very similar to what we've talked about with asbestos over the years. This is similar type of a product, except it is crystallized glass type shards that come off of different products. It means that the dust particles are small enough to enter the lungs when they are inhaled. When workers cut, grind, drill, or crush materials that contain this crystalline silica, very small dust particles are created. Sand plus heat equals glass, and small microbits equal crystalline silica. So it is part of our production, which we find in many different products, which we're going to cover. So what do we find these in building materials? Main form of crystalline silica is found in a quartz product. However, they're a very common mineral that is found in construction materials such as sand, stone, concrete, brick, tile, cement, and mortar. What is the exposure to your workers? So exposure to occupational dust in the workplace occurs through the breathing in of the dust particles generated from work-related activities such as cutting, grinding, drilling, or crushing materials that contain this crystalline silica, operating vehicle-mounted drilling rigs, milling, operating crushing machines, and using heavy-duty equipment for demo and certain other risks. Luckily, our concentration is on number one. So what do we do? How do we figure this out? So employers are required to ensure the health and safety of their workers and others at their job sites. Very similar to everything else that falls under the OSHA regulations. Employers have a duty to control the risks associated with the work. Workers must take reasonable care of their own health and safety, must not negatively affect the health and safety of other people, and follow any reasonable instruction in workplace health and safety policies. Employers should eliminate or reduce exposure to these hazards by following a risk management process. If suitable, control measurements are not in place, anyone working around silica dust has an increased risk of developing lung cancer. So this is the new phase that we're running into out there in the workplace. So I did just, it's real. I watched this study done on what's left of the coal mining industry, and more coal miners are getting lung cancer in their 30s, and it is not from coal dust. It is from silica dust. Reason being, they're grinding into more and more rock to get to the coal that's left. So it is a real issue, and we do deal with a lot of these issues when in our workplace. So we'll talk about them. So eliminate, get rid of. That's the number one. Substitute or change is number two. Engineer controls. Four, administrative controls. And five, personal protective equipment and earplugs. So, we're going to talk about what we can do there to comply. Now, the silica is going to change in what OSHA regulations. So again, like everything else we do, I always recommend that you go back to the OSHA and find out what the latest guidelines are. But let's talk about what it is, right? What is silicosis? Most common occupational lung disease worldwide. It occurs when silica dust enters the lungs and causes the formation of scar tissue, reducing the lung's ability to take in oxygen. Silicosis cannot be cured, but its progression can be slowed if exposure to silica is avoided, especially in the early stages. Early signs may include difficult breathing, shortness of breath, and may include chronic coughing. Effects of this silica on your body: microscopic lacerations, scar tissues that start to form in the lungs, creation of fibroids, non-detectable until 1 centimeter in size, now observable on an X-ray once it gets big enough. Scar tissue and fibroids prevent the exchange of gases in the lung tissue. Your body will be starved for oxygen. The condition is irreversible. Medical oxygen may be necessary as the disease progresses. So this is a serious disease. if we get exposed to it. What are some of the stats? Since 1968, the federal government has recorded a total of 16,305 silicosis-associated deaths. Roughly 75% occurred among persons greater than 65. 23 occurred 45 to 64, and 2% was 15 to 44. But as I just told you before, these stats are changing, and they're starting to find it more and more in younger adults. The World Health Organization says that workers in the United States are exposed to silica dust. 59,000 have developed silicosis, and about 166 die every year from this disease. So it's on the radar. In the United States alone, there's 3,600 to 7,300 new cases of silicosis annually. The only known treatment for advanced silicosis is a lung transplant. These costs can range anywhere from between 500,000 and 1.1 million, and they're going up every day. Silicosis has not only killed more than 250 people each year, but many others also die from indirect health effects of silicosis. But what the good news is, it's 100% preventable. So what do we do? By using the appropriate PPE, personal protection equipment, limiting the exposure, and abiding by the standards set forth, you can prevent yourself and your workers from getting this disease. Talk to your employer, employee representatives, or a union, if you're in the union, of any concern about the dust in your workplace. So again, this is newer than, it's been around a while, but it's still new and developing in what we really face out there. Alternate methods of exposure control. Determine the amount of silica that workers are exposed to. Is it or may reasonably be expected to be at or above an action level of 25 micrograms of silica per cubic meter of air averaged over an 8-hour day? Very similar to the way we used to monitor asbestos dust on a roof before they came up with the standards. So an engineer will come out, or a testing agency, and measure this. That's how they've started to get these standards. Use dust controls and safer workplace methods to protect workers from silica exposure above the PEL. Provide respirators to workers when dust controls and safer work methods cannot limit exposures to the PEL. So, what does the OSHA standard say? It requires worker exposures to respirators and silica dust and other steps to protect workers. Employers can either use a control method or they can measure workers' exposure to silica and independently decide whether the dust controls work best to limit the exposure in a workplace to that permissible exposure limit, or PEL. So we're going to more than likely fall to the first method, is we use the control method, then they measure workers' exposure. Independently, I don't believe we run into this enough in roofing that you're going to want to spend all this money testing yourself and not refer to what has actually already been tested. But again, that is a personal and company decision you must make within your own company and your safety policy. So, stationary masonry saws. Now, we are using these in roofing. We do cut tile. We do cut other things with these. The saw is equipped with an integrated water delivery system and continuously feeds water to the blade. Operate and maintain tool in accordance with manufacturer's instructions to minimize dust emissions. Required respiratory protection. Less than 4 hours, none. Greater than 4 hours, none. Why? Because it has the water control over it. So again, you can see if we follow the guidelines that are set out there, they're easily able to be enforced within your company. What else does this standard require? Must establish and implement a written exposure control plan. So it is up to you to create one of these exposure control plans within your company. So again, I recommend you get with your safety professional that you work with, or your in-house attorney that works with you on safety or OSHA issues, and create one of these policies. You need to identify the risks that involve exposure and the methods going to be used to protect your workers. Include procedures to restrict access to work areas where high exposure may occur. I don't think we're going to run into too many areas of high exposure that cannot be handled with a number one by identifying risks or involve exposure, but that's going to depend on the type of work that you do. Designate a competent person to implement the written exposure and control plan. So again, you can see this follows the same guidelines as many other OSHA requirements. Restrict housekeeping practices to expose workers with silica, such as the use of compressed air without ventilation to capture dust and dry sweeping. So, very important. Let's take a look at this. Let's take a look at a commercial roofing project or a low slope roofing project where we're going to be cutting into a reglet, or we may be drilling into concrete or mortar, and we get the exposure of the dust onto the decking or onto the roofing, and we need to clean it up. You will create a high exposure if you do sweep or blow this with a blower. So those are the things you must keep in mind of what you need to do to protect and put into your plan. Offer exams. These are a requirement every 3 years for workers who are required by the standard to wear a respirator for 30 or more days per year. So this is important. If you're not working in enough silica conditions with your plan, that respirators are required for more than 30 or more days per year. If you're using 10 days, then you would not need to offer exams. But again, check with what the current regulations are in your area because we have state OSHAs as well as federal OSHA guidelines. Train your workers on health effects of silica exposures. Again, just like we do in everything else, they must be trained and document. Keep records of workers' silica exposure and medical exams. You're required to keep track of these medical exams that they have actually attended them. The results of these are, due to HIPAA requirements, not going to be provided to you. But the actual record that exams were offered and they were attended is part of the record keeping. What can you do? Avoid eating, drinking, and using tobacco products in the work areas where these dusts or other toxic materials. Same thing as we do with asphalt, coal tar pitch when we were working in it, asbestos or other things. Just avoid the areas, right? Just what it says. Wash your hands and face before eating and drinking. Wear, maintain, and correctly use approved particulate respirators when other means are not adequate to reduce exposures. Make sure you have the right respirator for this product. Minimize dust by following good work practices such as removing dust with a water hose or vacuum with high efficiency particulate filters rather than blowing it with clean compressed air. Again, a good wet dry vac set up correctly that's meant for this, and you can buy them easily out there when you do run into this, will suffice and work. PPE. Respirators, P100 masks recommended light regular duty applications. Check with the vendor or marker for technical considerations. You got to make sure it's the right mask. Make sure you have the right size on your face. Again, it must be fitted correctly, just like other areas. Take in consideration possible facial hair. This comes a little more difficult with beards and mustaches. Abrasive blasting, air-fed helmets, a special condition. Unless you are actually abrasive, doing blasting on surfaces, which you may be if you're waterproofing. So depending on the type of work is what you're going to need for equipment. Protective clothing, hearing protection, and gloves. What not to wear. N95 masks are not good. Other simple masks that we use for prevention will not work. Single strap masks cannot use. They must be double strapped. Again, use the right mask for the right situation. So what are some of the key takeaways from this, right? First of all, you must understand what crystalline silica is. We've covered that. Health risks. We've talked about the health risks. It is a serious health risk if you are exposed to it. You don't want to expose your workers. You want to avoid this at all costs. Exposure and regulation. Workers exposed to silica during cutting, grinding, drilling of silica-containing materials. Employers must adhere to specific OSHA standards and maintain and mitigate silica exposure in the workplace. So again, like all other aspects of OSHA, workers must know what they're exposed to, and you must prevent it and have training in place for that. Preventative measures. Employ dust control measures, safety work practices, wet drills, drilling, local exhaust ventilation, depending on where you're at, and reduce airborne dust. Provide personal protective PPE, such as respirators, to workers who get when exposure cannot be adequately controlled by other means. So it's not always you have to have PPE. It depends on what you're doing. So again, we talked about the type of recommendations. Make sure you have the right mask. Your health, who you're talking to for buying your safety supplies will be able to set you up with the proper masks for whatever situation your workplace has you doing. Workplace safety practices. You must put in a comprehensive written exposure control plans. If you don't do this, anything else you're doing, wear a mask or whatever, you're going to get fined and be at risk for a fine because this is part of the requirements to have the plan in place. Health monitoring and training. Again, you will be required if you meet the standard of wearing masks, your respirators more than 30 plus days for providing medical exams for up to 3 years after exposure. So again, you can look at all these in the OSHA standard and talk to your safety professional and get yourself set up for what you need to do to be in this. And then it's very simply, it is preventable. So dust control, which we talked about, wet saws, proper PPE usage, and adherence to regulatory standards. So again, it is not as difficult to comply to this as one may think. It's just confusing because it's a standard. We're not sure if it's enforceable. Well, it is enforceable, but how often are we going to be enforced on it? Well, it takes that inspector to come out on the day you're doing something and ask the question. And they also can ask you a question anytime. Can I see, even if you're not in the middle of a silica prevention, can I see your written plan? Have these things ready. Again, like everything else, put it on your checklist, move beyond, get through it, have it ready to go, have your training, have everything in compliance. So, as always, I'll see you on the next one. If you have any questions, you can reach out to our club. They'll put you in touch, answer your question, or you can reach out directly to me at John Kenny at Cottney Consulting Group. Look forward to seeing you next month.